Texas, spring 1946. The war had been over for almost a year, but in the small town of Hearne, the sound of hammers still carried through the air like echoes of something that refused to end. The old POW chapel stood at the edge of what used to be Camp Hearne, its white paint long since peeled to gray. During the war, it had been built by German prisoners, who'd asked permission to hold Sunday services there, a humble wooden structure, with a cedar cross above the door and the faint smell of pine, tar and dust inside. Now it was quiet again, except for the scrape of shovels and the murmur of townsmen repairing its foundation. The army had sold the property to the county, and Reverend Sam Whitfield had a plan: turn the chapel into a community hall for everyone, townsfolk and returning veterans alike. By noon, sunlight filtered through the open rafters, turning sawdust into gold dust. "Careful with that wall," Sam said, his voice echoing. "We're patching, not rebuilding." A worker named Jesse tugged at a loose brick near the altar base. "This one's got a hollow sound, Reverend. You sure we shouldn't pull it?" Sam wiped his hands on his overalls and walked over. "If it's ready to fall, better we take it than the next storm." Jesse tapped it once more with his chisel. The brick shifted, giving way with a soft scrape. Something clattered behind it. They both froze. Sam reached into the cavity, fingers brushing cool metal. When he pulled back, he was holding a small tin box, no bigger than a loaf of bread, its edges sealed with old wax and stamped faintly with the letters KG. Initials burned deep into the lid. "Well, I'll be," Jesse said softly. "Think that's Army issue?" Sam turned the box in his hands. The wax had cracked, but the metal was still tight. "No, this looks handmade." He set it carefully on the altar and used his pocket knife to pry the edge. The seal broke with a sigh of old air. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small brown notebook bound in leather, edges darkened by age, corners worn smooth by someone's thumb. Across the cover, written in neat pencil strokes, were two words in German, "Gebete hinter Draht." Sam frowned. "What's that mean?" "Prayers behind wire," said a voice from the doorway. They turned. Clara Reeves, the local schoolteacher, stood in the sunlight with a stack of hymnals under her arm. She was in her 30s, her hair pinned up in the way of women who'd carried both grief and grace through the war. "Sorry," she said. "Didn't mean to eavesdrop." Sam smiled faintly. "You read German?" "Enough to teach it. My father spoke it before the war." "Well then, Miss Reeves," Sam said, setting the book in her hands, "you may have just found yourself a new assignment." They gathered that evening around the chapel's front pew. Sam, Clara, Jesse, and two of the former guards who'd stayed in town after discharge. The only light came from a single oil lamp flickering against the wall like a heart that refused to die out. Clara opened the cover carefully. Inside the first page, written in tidy script, was a name: Chaplain Matthias Krüger, Camp Hearne, Texas, 1944. Below it, an inscription in English: "To whoever finds these words, may they remember that even in captivity, we were still free to pray." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Clara turned the page. The first entry read, "August 14th, 1944. We built the altar from leftover lumber. It stands crooked, but so do we. Today an American guard asked if we prayed for Germany or for ourselves. I told him, neither. We pray for peace because someone must." Sam leaned forward. "Lord above," she continued reading. "September 2nd. Some of the men think God is on one side or the other. I told them he's in the space between. I have begun writing these entries in English, so that one day those who read them will know we were not their enemies. Only men who remembered their mother's prayers." Jesse exhaled. "He wrote that here? While they were locked up?" Clara nodded. "It's dated right in the middle of the war." Sam rubbed his chin. "He must have hidden it when the camp shut down." The second guard, an older man named Price, stared at the notebook like it might burn. "I was here in 44, he said quietly. "I remember the chaplain. Tall fellow, always smiling. Used to hum hymns while carrying water buckets. Didn't talk much English, but when he did, he'd say, 'We pray same sky.'" The room went still. They read until the lamp burned low. Each page was a window. Prayers for rain, for home, for the American guards who watched them with rifles and loneliness in equal measure. One entry stood out above all the rest. Clara read it twice before translating. "December 25th, 1944, Christmas Day. We were given candles. The guards allowed us to sing in our language. I prayed not for victory, but for forgiveness. If they ever read this, tell them we prayed for them too." Her voice cracked on the last line. Nobody moved. The only sound was the distant wind through the chapel rafters. When Sam finally spoke, His voice was soft. Maybe this was meant to be found now. When we need it most, Jesse cleared his throat. You think we should tell the town? Clara closed the journal carefully, her hands trembling. Yes, she said. The war ended a year ago, but people here are still fighting it. Maybe this is how we stop. By the next morning, word had spread. The Hearne Chronicle printed a single headline on its front page. Hidden journal found in old POW chapel. We prayed for them too. Some townsfolk were moved. Others were skeptical. You telling me prisoners wrote about praying for us? One man muttered at the diner. Forgive me if I ain't buying it, but curiosity won over doubt. By Sunday, the chapel was full again. The first time in years. The same wooden benches that had once held German prisoners now held American farmers, widows, and soldiers. At the front, Clara stood with the journal in her hands. She looked at Reverend Sam, who nodded. She took a deep breath and began to read aloud. March 3rd, 1945. A storm broke last night. The lightning struck the fence and lit the sky like morning. One of the guards helped me patch the damage. When I thanked him, he said, "It's just duty." I think he meant something else. Sometimes I wonder if mercy is just another word for duty, the one we owe to one another, no matter what flag we wore. When she finished, the chapel was silent. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Then an older woman near the back, Mrs. Collins, whose son had died in France, rose from her seat. Her voice trembled as she said, "Let her keep reading." And so Clara did. Page by page, line by line, the war began to lose its edges. By evening, the journal lay open on the altar, its pages catching the last light of day. Reverend Sam rested his hand on it gently. "You can almost feel him here," he whispered. Clara nodded. Maybe he never left. Outside, the chapel bell rang once. Slow, clear, unhurried. The sound of something old being forgiven at last. For 3 days after the discovery, the small Texas town of Hearne spoke of little else. At the barber shop, the hardware store, even in the post office line, you could hear it whispered. They found a POW's journal. Said he prayed for Americans. The reaction split straight down the middle like a fence through pasture. Half the town said it was a sign from heaven. Proof that the world could heal after all that killing. The other half muttered that it was a trick, a ploy to soften what the war had hardened. Reverend Sam knew both sides were right in their own way. He'd buried too many boys from this county to forget the cost. But he'd also spent enough nights tending to men's guilt to know that hate was an illness that didn't end with a surrender. That Wednesday evening, the chapel filled again. The benches groaned under the weight of curiosity and disbelief. The front rows were crowded with farmers still in their work clothes, veterans with service pins, widows in black. Clara Reeves stood near the altar, the leather-bound journal cradled in her hands like a fragile relic. Her voice was calm, but inside her chest her heart drummed like a field snare. Reverend Sam nodded to her. "Whenever you're ready, Miss Reeves." She opened to a new section, pages yellowed and written partly in English, partly in German. April 12, 1945. Word reached us today that the war is nearly over. The men cheered quietly, not for victory, but for rest. Some wept. I went to the fence and looked east. The guard on duty asked what I was staring at. I told him home. He said, "Me too." The room was utterly still. April 18th. We began repairing the chapel roof today. The Americans gave us tools. I worked beside one who said his brother died in France. He asked if I was sorry. I told him yes, but not for being German. I am sorry for being human and forgetting what that meant. Clara's voice caught on the word human. She stopped, looked up, and saw tears glistening on faces she hadn't expected. Old Mr. Dyer, who'd lost both sons, Ruth McKinley, whose husband had come home but never smiled again. April 22nd. At night I pray not for victory, but for the strength to keep forgiving. The men do not understand this yet. Perhaps neither do I. But forgiveness feels like breathing after years underwater. When she finished, no one clapped. They just sat in quiet reverence, as if afraid noise might break something sacred that had settled over them. Finally, from the back, a voice spoke, gravelly, cautious. "I remember that chaplain," said an old guard named Frank Price. "He used to hum when he worked. Never complained, never cursed. I once gave him extra bread after a storm tore the roof. He split it into 6 pieces and passed it down the line." A murmur rippled through the pews. Another man rose, a war veteran, Sergeant Bailey, his left arm missing below the elbow. "You really think he meant it? All that forgiving talk?" Clara looked at him. "I think he wrote it because he needed it. Maybe we all do." The sergeant nodded slowly, then sat. After the service, small groups lingered outside the chapel under the pecan trees. The air smelled of rain and cut wood. Some argued that the journal was just sentimentality. Others said it was scripture in disguise. At the edge of the crowd, Reverend Sam turned to Clara. "You think we should keep reading it every week?" "Yes," she said firmly. If words like these survived behind a wall for 2 years, they were meant to be heard. He smiled. "Then you'll do the honors Sunday." That Sunday morning, the chapel overflowed. Reporters from Waco and Dallas arrived with notepads. A local photographer set up his flash camera. The congregation spilled out the doors into the spring sunshine. Clara stood once more at the front. This time she wasn't nervous. She'd spent nights translating the rest of the entries, each one a piece of something larger, a man's faith, written when the world was burning. She turned to a new passage marked with a scrap of red ribbon. May 8th, 1945. The day the war ended. They let us ring the chapel bell. Some of us cried, others stood silent. I did not feel free, only small, like dust after rain. Yet I thanked God that no one else would die today. I wrote a final sermon that I never gave. I will hide it here in the wall. Perhaps one day, someone who hates me will find it and see that I hated no one. The crowd was motionless. Even the reporters lowered their pencils. Clara looked up from the page. "That's the last full entry," someone asked softly. "Does it end there?" She shook her head. "There's one more page, a loose one tucked inside the back cover." She unfolded the thin sheet, its ink faded but legible. "To the next generation, war ends many times, but peace begins only once. You cannot build it with weapons. You build it with hands that once held them, and words that once cursed now bless. Mercy is the bridge that survives fire." A sound escaped the crowd, not applause, not even sobs. More like a collective breath they'd all been holding since 1941 finally let go. The old widows cried openly. The veterans stared at the floor. Mrs. Collins, who had asked her to keep reading days earlier, approached the altar afterward. "My boy died in France," she whispered. "I used to hate every German I saw in newsreels. But I don't think I do anymore. Not after hearing him pray for us." Clara placed a hand on her arm. "Then maybe that's what this journal was for." That week, the town changed. Slowly but unmistakably. The Veterans Club invited the German laborers who had stayed on after release to join their Sunday picnics. Local children began playing baseball on the same field that had once been part of the camp compound. Someone painted the chapel door white again, and the cross above it shone like new. The Hearne Chronicle printed a follow-up story. The journal that healed Hearne. Former enemies joined to rebuild chapel. Copies of the article spread as far as Houston. Churches requested readings of the entries. Radio hosts quoted lines like sermons. One night, Clara and Reverend Sam sat inside the empty chapel, the journal resting between them on the altar. The lamplight flickered across the pages. "Funny," Sam said. "This building used to divide people. Guards from prisoners, Americans from Germans. Now folks say they feel closer to God here than anywhere else." Clara smiled. "That's because the walls finally started speaking." Later that month, they received an unexpected visitor, a middle-aged man with a German accent who introduced himself as Erich Krüger, the chaplain's younger brother. He held the newspaper clipping in his hand. "Someone mailed me this," he said softly. "I came from Bremen to see it." Reverend Sam offered him the journal. "It belongs to your family." Eric opened the cover and ran his fingers over the handwriting. Matthias always said he wanted to build a bridge with words. He looked up, eyes wet. "Seems he finally did." Clara hesitated. Would you like to read from it this Sunday?" Eric nodded, voice thick with emotion. "Yes, but not for him. For you. For what you made of him." That Sunday was unlike any the town had seen. The chapel packed beyond capacity. Cameras flashed as Eric read aloud his brother's words, the same ones Clara had translated. His German voice filled the room, steady and full, echoing off the wooden beams. Even those who didn't understand every word felt it. The cadence of grace, the rhythm of forgiveness. When he finished, he placed the journal back on the altar and said in halting English, "My brother's prayer was for all of you. I think you answered." Reverend Sam stepped forward, tears visible in his beard. "Friends," he said, "we started fixing this chapel to patch its walls, but looks like heaven sent us a better kind of repair." The crowd laughed softly through their tears. That evening, as the sun sank behind the pecan trees, Clara lingered inside after everyone had left. She ran her fingers over the rough bricks of the altar, imagining the chaplain sealing that tin box behind them 2 years earlier. she whispered. "We found it, Matthias. We heard you." The wind moved gently through the open windows, lifting the pages of the journal like a slow nod. Outside, the bell rang once, low and certain, the sound of a town remembering how to breathe again. By June, the journal had grown into something larger than paper. It passed through hands and homes like a lantern, and wherever it paused, the room felt warmer. Pastors clipped lines for Sunday bulletins. Teachers used it in civics lessons about what peace demands. At the diner, men who'd once traded headlines now traded sentences. "Mercy is the bridge that survives fire." Folks said it the way you say grace, quietly, as if the words worked better when they landed soft. Requests arrived faster than anyone expected. A Methodist church in Waco asked Clara to bring the journal for a shared reading with a German-language congregation. A Houston station wanted to record an evening program called Letters from Behind the Wire. A veterans post up in Dallas invited Reverend Sam to speak at a memorial with former POWs in attendance. The town council, surprised to find themselves part of something hopeful, voted to preserve the chapel not just as a hall but as a living place of prayer. "Never figured paper could move a town," Jesse said one afternoon, leaning a shoulder against the doorway, while Clara wrapped the journal in its oilcloth for travel. Clara smiled. "Paper didn't. A person did. He just happened to write it down." They carried that understanding into the summer, a shared gentleness you could feel at the grocer's counter, at the feed store, at the Thursday night softball field where veterans and former guards now chose teams by coin toss rather than by memory. More than once, a German volunteer wandered by the backstop with a box of lemonade and ended up pinch hitting. When the ball rose into the long light and two benches yelled at the same time, it sounded like one town instead of two sides. The county, catching up to what hearts already knew, set a date. August 24th, 1946, a dedication day for the chapel and the ground around it. The plan was simple: a short service, a meal under the pecans, and the planting of a ring of trees to shade a new space they were calling the Peace Garden. "Shade first," Reverend Sam told the council. "We're building something meant to outlast our tempers. Shade is patience you can stand under." In the weeks leading up to the day, people brought what they could: a bench built from leftover cedar, a tin watering can polished to a shine, packets of seeds labeled in careful script. Children painted smooth stones with single words, mercy, trust, peace, and stacked them beside the altar like small promises. The morning came clean and bright, as if Texas itself had set its anger down. Cars rolled in from every direction, farm trucks with lawn chairs rattling in the back, a bus from Waco full of choir members, a dusty sedan with KRLD radio hand-painted on the side. The bell rope swayed in a slow breeze. Somewhere a camera flash popped, and the light fractured into glitter before it vanished. Inside, the chapel filled. Outside, amplifiers carried the sound into the garden, where latecomers spread quilts on the grass. At the front, a modest table held the journal in a glass frame, its cracked leather showing like an old scar with a good story behind it. Beside it stood Erich Krüger in his suit from Bremen, borrowed tie, polished shoes, eyes that still looked restless, as if searching for his brother's shoulders in a crowd. Reverend Sam stepped to the front and let the room settle itself. "We came here to fix a roof," he said. "The Lord sent us a better repair. You know by now about Chaplain Matthias Krüger, the way he rode into the dark as if anyone could read from there. Today we don't make a saint of him. Saints don't need what we're about to do. We make neighbors of each other. Neighbors need everything we've got." A murmur of assent traveled the pews. He turned to Clara. "Miss Reeves, will you read the last page once more for those in the grass who brought their patience?" Clara breathed in, lifted the frame's cover, and unfolded the thin sheet, the one Matthias had tucked into the back cover for a day he couldn't see. To the next generation, war ends many times, but peace begins only once. You cannot build it with weapons. You build it with hands that once held them and words that once cursed now bless. Mercy is the bridge that survives fire. The words slid into the open air and seemed to keep going, out through the doorway, across the garden, up into the trees where a mockingbird paused in its scolding as if it, too, were listening. Eric stepped forward then, voice unsteady and proud. "In Bremen," he said, "I work at a dock where ships are repaired. We hammer plates against holes and say the ship is made whole. Reading my brother's words here, I think maybe towns can be made whole too. Thank you for helping me finish his bridge." The choir sang, not loudly, just enough to lace the day with melody. "It was nearer, my God, to thee," which the Germans knew, and so the harmony arrived like two languages remembering they had the same root. After the hymn, they moved outside to plant trees, live oaks in a circle, their future shade already visible if you believed in such things. Veterans dug the holes, left-handed, right-handed, slow and steady. Former POWs tamped the soil with the flat of their shovels. Children carried water in the polished tin can, taking turns as if it were a badge. On each sapling, someone tied a paper ribbon with a sentence from the journal. The breeze flicked them gently. When it came time to place something beneath the central stone, Reverend Sam held up a simple wooden box. "We made copies," he said, "in case time is clumsy with the original. One for the ground, one for the library, one we'll send to Bremen, and one that will stay here on the altar. That way, no one has to dig to find the words again." He lifted the lid. Inside lay 4 booklets, hand-bound with twine, each stamped on the first page with a phrase Clara had chosen. "We prayed under the same sky." They set one copy into the shallow earth and lowered the round stone over it. The stone had been sanded smooth and etched with the line that had become the town's spine. "Mercy is the bridge that survives fire." The bell rang once, low and generous. Heads bowed without orders. After the service, people stayed, talking, laughing, telling the truth carefully the way you do when language matters. Eric stood near the fence line with Price, the old guard, comparing memories like men checking measurements on a beam they had raised together. "You gave him bread," Eric said at last. "He wrote that he split it 6 ways. Price rubbed the back of his neck. "I figured he would. You ever notice how some men are always building a table, even when all they've got is a crust?" Near the pecans, 2 boys, one American, one German-born to a laborer who had stayed on, traded a baseball glove back and forth, practicing the art of letting go and the skill of receiving. Every so often the ball popped in the pocket and both grinned at the sound. It was ordinary, and it was holy. By late afternoon, only a few lingered in the garden's new shade, watching shadows lengthen like the day learning how to rest. Clara walked the circle of trees, checking each ribbon. One had caught a branch and knotted itself. She loosened it gently and smoothed the paper with her thumb. The line read, "Sometimes I wonder if mercy is just another word for duty, the one we owe to one another, no matter what flag we wore." "Good duty," she whispered. Eric found her there. "May I ask something?" "Of course." "When you first read the journal, did anyone tell you not to?" he asked, half smiling, already knowing the answer. "A few," she said. "Said it would stir up pain." "And did it?" "Yes," Clara said, "but it stirred it the way a doctor does, to clean it." He nodded, eyes on the saplings. "In a year these will be taller than a man." "In a year," she agreed. "And long after we're done talking, they'll still throw shade. Time, as it does, went on. Autumn blunted the heat. Then winter slipped in with its thin light and honest cold. The oaks settled their roots. The ribbons weathered, but held. The chapel door took a new coat of white paint without complaint. The journal remained on the altar in its glass, available by simple request. Teenagers signed it out to write essays that sounded less like reports and more like letters. Brides asked the Reverend to read a line before their vows. "You build peace with hands that once held weapons." At funerals, the humbler passages, about rain on tin roofs and bread shared 6 ways, were the ones people repeated beside the open ground. The ripples widened without spectacle. A church in Waco started a same-sky pen pal program with a congregation in Bremen. The feed store put a coffee can on the counter labeled Mercy Fund. By spring, it paid for a new roof on a widow's house with no headline at all. The school board added a 1-page reading from the journal to the 8th grade curriculum, with a note from Clara. "These are not foreign words. They are ours now." Years later, when storms came, and they always came, the bell rope swung and the garden gave what it had promised. A place to stand out of the downpour together, to listen to the water talk about what it erases and what it cannot touch. On the 10th anniversary of the dedication, the town hosted a small reunion. A handful of former guards returned with canes and jokes older than their bones. 2 families from Germany flew in with photographs of men who had prayed in that room when it was new. The children, now adults, walked the circle of oaks taller than they could have imagined in 1946. At the center stone, someone had tucked wildflowers. The carved words had taken on the soft polish only time can give. Clara, a little grayer and much surer, stood with Reverend Sam, now simply Sam. Retired, but unable to stop showing up early to unlock the door. She opened the glass and lifted the journal with the care of a friend picking up a baby. The leather had darkened, but the pages still smelled faintly. Of cedar and old rain. She read one last passage, the one she had saved for anniversaries because it sounded like a benediction written by a man who knew there would be people standing exactly where she stood. Forgiveness is what time sounds like. When it finally learns to breathe, silence followed, not empty, but full of that rare kind of quiet that only arrives when a truth has landed where it was always meant to live. A breeze moved through the oaks, and the trees answered in their leafy language. Somebody laughed softly for no great reason. Somebody else wiped their eyes and didn't apologize. As dusk pooled in the low places and the bell offered a single, unhurried note, Clara closed the journal and held it against her chest. She thought of the hidden brick, the tin box, the oilcloth, the way a man had written so carefully to people he could not imagine. She thought of how those people had found his words, and instead of arguing with them, had tried to live inside them. She thought of the saplings that had become shade, and the shade that had become habit. Walking back toward the chapel door, she paused and turned around for one more look. The garden, the stone, the ring of trees, none of it grand, all of it good. Simple proofs that a town had decided to be more than the worst thing it remembered. Behind her, a child tugged a parent's sleeve. "Why did they bury a book?" the child asked, pointing toward the center stone. "To make sure we'd never run out of the story," the parent said. Clara smiled at that and kept walking. Inside, she set the journal on the altar, straightened the glass, and snuffed the lamp. In the dim, the room held a warmth of its own. You could almost hear, if you were the listening sort, a page turning somewhere, soft as breath, sure as morning. Outside the door swung to with a gentle click, and the bell above it chimed once for good measure. The sound drifted across the fields and into the kind of night that carries news further than you'd guess. It wasn't much, some would have said. A book, a garden, a habit of mercy. But to the people of Hearne, 1946, it was enough. The war had ended on a calendar. Peace had begun on a page, then in a room, then in a town, then in the lives of anyone willing to build a bridge and trust it would hold. And it did.